Today we are starting the Odyssey by Homer, and it is translated by Robert Fitzgerald. And so we are going to dig into part one and read the invocation first. So I just want to clarify in the opening scene right here, it says Homer addresses the muse of epic poetry. He asks her to help in telling the tale of Odysseus. So Homer is actually speaking in this open scene, and an invocation is equivalent to like saying a prayer or like your pregame speech before you go on to your performance. And so Homer is asking the muse of epic poetry to help him. And he is going to tell us really the themes of the Odyssey, because that's what epics do in the invocation. They portray a certain theme. So he says, "Sing in me, muse, and tell me the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending, the wanderer, harried for years on end after he plundered the stronghold on the proud height of Troy." Now, I want to talk about this word right here, contending. That means that Odysseus is a contender. That means that he had to fight. So the Trojan War has lasted 10 years, and now he is on his way home to see his wife and his son. He hasn't met his son since his son was an infant. So it's important that he fights to get home. Homer tells us he saw the townlands and learned the minds of many distant men, and weathered many bitter nights and days in his deep heart at sea, while he fought only to save his life, to bring his shipmates home. But not by will nor power could he save them, for their own recklessness destroyed them all, children and fools. They killed and feasted on the cattle of Lord Helios, the sun, and he who moves all day through heaven took from their eyes the dawn of their return. Of these adventures, Muse, daughter of Zeus, tell us in our time, lift the great song again. And so Odysseus here, he is telling us that Odysseus is fighting at sea, and he's fighting for his shipmates' life. However, he's not going to be able to save his shipmates, because he tells us here they are children and fools, because they feasted on the cattle of Lord Helios. And so basically, Odysseus's friends, their own recklessness destroyed themselves. And so we know that if you're traveling on the sea, you don't want to make one of the gods mad, and that's definitely going to be Poseidon. So Poseidon is plotting against Odysseus. Moving on to the episode Sailing from Troy, I just want to clarify that the Trojan War lasted 10 years. And then how many years has Odysseus spent trying to return home? Well, he has spent another 10 years trying to return home. And so before I launch into telling you about or reading Sailing from Troy, I'm going to tell you about Calypso. So Calypso is a sea goddess who loved Odysseus so very much. She actually held him captive on her island. And they were basically boyfriend and girlfriend, if you want to put it that way. And so Odysseus is actually telling us this story, and he mentions Calypso. He mentions another goddess named Circe, and he tells us that he was with them, but he didn't mean it in his heart. Wah, wah. And so you have to be careful with our narrator here, Odysseus, because he is going to spin this tale however he wants. And so I think Odysseus is not the best reliable narrator. So he is a little bit unreliable, because he's going to stretch the truth a lot and make himself look good. And so Odysseus is actually captured and put on Calypso's island, the sea goddess. And so Hermes shows up and tells Calypso, hey, if you don't let Odysseus go, Zeus is going to destroy your island. And so we get a sense of jealousy from Calypso. She's not happy with Hermes for telling her this, but Calypso stays jealous because Odysseus loves his wife Penelope, and that's ultimately Odysseus's goal. Even though he has been on Calypso's island for years, he's still thinking about his wife Penelope. And Calypso knows that. She knows that she doesn't have his true heart. And so she is definitely jealous of Penelope. And Calypso basically goes to Odysseus and says, "Yo, Odysseus, you can leave my island or you can go home. If you stay on my island, Odysseus, you will be immortal and you will live forever and you will live with me, a beautiful goddess. But if you go home, you'll go to your Penelope and you'll grow old and die." And so he has this chance to live forever with a beautiful woman, beautiful goddess. And he says no. He chooses his wife. He wants to grow old with his wife and die. Oh, how sweet. You think that, right? So Odysseus regards Penelope as like the love of his life. And so while he chooses his wife, Calypso has to help Odysseus home per Zeus, because if she doesn't, he's going to destroy her island. And so she actually gives Odysseus the materials so he can build a ship. And so while he is on this ship leaving Calypso's island, a storm hits. Okay, this tragedy at sea that strikes Odysseus is a storm. And so Odysseus washes up on King Alcinous's island, and this Phaeacian king cannot believe that Odysseus is in front of him, and he is received on this island, and he is cherished, and he is basically just like, they can't believe he's alive. And so the king and his wife have Odysseus sit down, and they're saying, "Hey, Odysseus, tell us that story. Like, what all happened to you after you left Troy? Like, why is it taking you another 10 years to get home?" And so this is why the story begins in media res. It begins in the middle of everything. And so Odysseus sits down and he has this like ginormous flashback all the way to when he left Troy. And so this is where we're going to start right here, where it says sailing from Troy. So this is where he's like launched from Troy, and he's telling the king everything that's happened to him. This is why Odysseus is an unreliable narrator, because he is going to make himself look really, really good. Don't forget that hubris is Odysseus's tragic flaw, which means excessive pride. He absolutely loves himself. And so I'm going to read this and point some things out to you. So sailing from Troy. 10 years after the Trojan War, Odysseus departs from the goddess Calypso's island. He arrives in Phaeacia, ruled by Alcinous. Alcinous offers a ship to Odysseus and asks him to tell of his adventures. "I am Laertes' son, Odysseus. Men hold me formidable for guile in peace and war. This fame has gone abroad to the sky's rim." Okay, hold up, y'all. So he is telling us, with this epithet, "I'm Laertes' son, Odysseus, and men hold him formidable for guile," which means craftiness and cunningness in peace and war. And this fame has just like gone everywhere. So basically Odysseus is like, "Hey, I'm Odysseus and everybody knows who I am. Bet." And so he thinks very, very highly of himself. And now he's going to describe his home Ithaca to us. "My home is on the peaked sea mark of Ithaca, under Mount Neon's wind-blown robe of leaves, in sight of other islands, Ducalium, Same, wooded Zacynthus, Ithaca being most lofty in that coastal sea, and northwest, while the rest lie east and south. A rocky isle, but good for a boy's training. I shall not see on earth a place more dear, though I have been detained long by Calypso, loveliest among goddesses, who held me in her smooth caves to be her heart's delight, as Circe of Aea, the enchantress, desired me and detained me in her hall. But in my heart I never gave consent. Where shall a man find sweetness to surpass his own home and his parents? In far lands he shall not, though he find a house of gold." And so what is Ithaca like here? So let's go back up here and look. So Ithaca is an island off of the west coast of Greece, and Odysseus describes it as being a good like coastal island, and it's rocky, but it's good for training. And he's never ever seen on earth a place more dear in his heart. So he loves his home. He thinks highly of his home. And he describes it being under a wind-blown robe of leaves. That's actually some pretty beautiful imagery we have here. You think of a robe, you think of royalty, and you're just thinking of a royal robe made of leaves. So he's basically putting Ithaca on a pedestal of how awesome he thinks it is. And so Odysseus continues here. Just remember, he's talking to King Alcinous and his wife. And then he says, "What of my sailing then from Troy? What of those years of rough adventure, weathered under Zeus? The wind that carried west from Ilium brought me to Ismarus on the far shore, a strong point on the coast of Cicones. I stormed that place and killed the men who fought. Plunder we took, and we enslaved the women to make division, equal shares to all. But on the spot I told them, back and quickly, out to sea again. My men were mutinous, fools on stores of wine. Sheep after sheep they butchered by the surf, and shambling cattle feasting, while fugitives went inland, running to call to arms the main force of Cicones. This was an army, trained to fight on horseback, or where the ground required on foot. They came with dawn over that terrain like the leaves and blades of spring. So doom appeared to us, dark word of Zeus for us, our evil days. My men stood up and made a fight of it, backed on the ships, with lances kept in play, from bright morning through the blaze of noon, holding our beach, although so far outnumbered. But when the sun passed toward unyoking time, then the Achaeans one by one gave way. 6 benches were left empty in every ship that evening when we pulled away from death. And this new grief we bore with us to sea. Our precious lives we had, but not our friends. No shipmate sailed next day until some shipmate had raised a cry 3 times for each poor ghost unfleshed by the Cicones on that field." All right, so there is a line that signals Odysseus's flashback here. And so it is going to be up here. What of my sailing then from Troy? What of those years of rough adventure weathered under Zeus? So Zeus is watching them, and this is where he has his flashback to leaving Troy and going to Ismarus. So if you look right here, this is Troy. This is where Odysseus is leaving, and he's saying he and his crewmates went over here to the island of the Cicones. And so the Cicones are these really, really good fighters, and they basically slaughtered some of Odysseus's men. But I want to talk about what happened exactly here, because we can't trust Odysseus and what he's saying, because he shifts his pronouns around a little bit. He goes from, I did this and I did that. And then he says, we did this and we did that. So by saying we, he is including himself with his crew. And so let's take a look of where he changes up these personal pronouns. So Odysseus says when they got off the ship, they stormed that place and killed the men who fought. They killed the people on the shore. Plunder we took. Plunder means like they're stealing loot. And he says, we enslaved the women. Ew. And then he also says to make division equal shares to all. And yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. So Odysseus isn't quite the gentleman you think. And then he says, but on the spot, I told them. So do you see this shift in personal pronouns? Like we've got we and we did this, but then I told them back and quickly, like, stop doing this. And then he says we need to get out to sea again. And then he tells the king, he's like, you know what? My men were mutinous, meaning they were rebellious.